the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about budgets. And I usually do it in a lot longer session, but I have sworn to them that I will not go over today, that we will stay within time. I have spent my career in cities, in counties. I'm now at the state. I've been at the university, and I have a consultancy that's allowed me to see a lot of different public budgets, not only in Utah, but around the world. And I'll tell you that there are two truths to every budget. You never have enough money, and you never have enough people. And I don't see either of those truths changing anytime soon. And so hopefully I can give you a few keys and a few things to think about this morning that let you have a budgeting job that's just a little bit easier. But really the goal is that I hope that I pass on some of my enthusiasm for budgeting and the budgeting process so that you want to know more. And you'll reach out to the league and ask for more, or you'll come down to St. George and you'll be in a longer session where we can go into a little bit more detail. I have three things I want you to leave with today. I want you to understand basic municipal budgeting rules in Utah. I want you to understand the budgeting process at a very high level. And I really want to instill in you to use the beginner status that you have. In my home agency at the Utah Department of Heritage and Arts, we are encouraging all of our employees to think like a beginner. Ask questions. Look at it like you don't know anything about it. Use that status that you have right now as new to government, new to city government. Ask those questions. Challenge some of the ways that we've always been doing things, because that's where innovation happens. That's where some of the breakthrough happens. So use your beginner status as an asset, not a liability. I saw that most of you are new to your positions. How many are new to government budgeting? You kind of never dealt with a government budget before. Okay, so I'm going to give you a lot of basic information really fast this morning, but don't worry, because I'm around and you can call and you can email. I'll email you back at night. I mean, Cam sends these emails through to me that he gets from local officials, and sorry, you see my response around 11 p.m. or midnight, but I'll get back with you if you email those questions in. We're going to cover what's a budget, some budgeting basics, the process, monitoring the budget, just really briefly we'll talk about that. And if by chance I have time left, I have a little module called Property Tax 101 that we'll get through. I don't think we'll make it though. Cam's going to give me the 5-minute mark when we're there. So what is a budget? It's a basic financial plan, but I think it is so much more than that. And that is why I get really excited about budgeting. Really, the budget is the way that you demonstrate those reasons that you ran for office. When Cam asks you, why did you run for office? The budget is the way you show that to the public. You demonstrate to them what your priorities are and that you're accomplishing the goals and you're doing the things you wanted to do because the budget shows it. And I would say planning matters, but budget planning matters too. So your LTAP person who just spoke to you, he didn't show you this picture. This is what happens if you don't plan. But the same kind of disastrous things happen if you don't plan your budget. You've got to plan it as well. And I will suggest to you, don't you tell me what you value. Don't raise your hand and say, I value parks, I value those things. Show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value. I'll tell you what your values are based on where you're spending your money. And I like to just do a little really quick demonstration to show you this. So I hope you can see that on the screen. This is my after-tax spending. I take a look at this each year. It makes my husband shudder, usually, when we look at it. But what do I value? I value tuition. I value education. I value my children. What's the other thing? What do I like to do? Travel. You can see it in my numbers. I value travel. On my social media, people usually say, are you ever in town? And I really am. I only post when I'm out of town because I value travel, and you can see it in my numbers. I would suggest if you do this personally, you'll probably see what you value in your own personal budget, and the same is true for your municipal budget. So when we talk about a municipal budget, what is it? It's more than just an accounting of your revenue and your expenses. It really is that policy plan to demonstrate, show me the money, tell me what we're doing, tell me where we're going. And if you come in and you're just taking last year's numbers and you're adjusting them a little bit and then you're adopting a new set of numbers, I would say that you're doing a pretty good accounting function, but not so much budgeting. Budgeting takes talking about where do we want to realign things. We want to see, are we getting there? Are we measuring? Are we getting to where we want to be as a community? And if not, do we not need to shift some of the resources so that we can get there? It really is your tool. And if you're only budgeting in May and June, you're not budgeting. You're kind of accounting at that point. Budgeting means that you're involved in conversation sort of more holistically throughout the year. So I'm going to talk to you about some definitions, deadlines, and requirements, but I want to start with what I think is one of the most important parts of the budget, and it's the budget message. So you can, especially if you're in a smaller community, you can just publish tables of numbers, and that's fine. That meets the legal limit. And Dave Church talked to you a lot this morning about what do you have to do to be the minimum. And I'm suggesting you go a step higher than the minimum. And if you don't have it in your community already, please make sure that the first budget you adopt has a budget message. And that budget message talks about the assumptions that were used, talks about the factors, the economic factors that are driving the revenue and are driving the expenses within your community, talks about the opportunities that the numbers are reflecting. What was an opportunity that you took this year in the budget when you adopted those numbers? And you focus on some of the changes from the prior year. You know, last year we were doing this, and this year we're going to try to accomplish X, Y, or Z. And you talk it through in a narrative format that's understandable, and you demystify the numbers for the public. And then just kind of sets the overall tone and message for the government. So when you have that budget message, it's going to be focusing kind of on these key elements that are in the budget. So for those of you who are new to government budgeting, we do a thing that's called fund budgeting. We have funds. And I think they're fun, but they're funds. And what a fund is a self-balancing set of numbers. And so when Dave Church talks to you about the different roles that you have, and when you're acting legislatively as a body versus acting as an executive, funds are kind of important to understand, because moving money from one fund to another fund requires council action. And it's because it's a policy shift. If you're taking money out of a water fund and you're putting the money in the general fund, that's a policy shift. And you have to have legislative action to do it, and you have to have a public hearing, and you have to invite the public in to talk about it, because you're making a policy shift in what you're doing. So I've talked about the funds. What are they? First, you have a general fund. Your general fund, main sources of revenue in that fund, taxes. You might have a few fees, business license fees, things like that. But it really is where your property tax, your sales tax, your energy sales and use tax, that's what really drives that general fund. What kinds of services do you fund from there? The basic services of government. Police, fire, parks. In the mid-'80s to the early '90s, those of us that were kicking around government, we started a trend of trying to protect that general fund because the resources in that fund were so scarce. So we pulled out of those general funds almost anything we could charge a fee for. And if we could charge a fee for it and we could link it to a user, we pulled it out. And so now a lot of you, how many have a garbage fee in your community? Yep, lots of hands. That's because we can charge a user fee for it, so we run it in another fund. And that other fund is called, left off the list, ironically as I look at it, an enterprise fund. An enterprise fund, for those of you in business, you like those a little bit more. You understand them. It looks a little bit more like a business, where you have the revenue, which is the user fee, and then you have the expenses associated with that discrete service. Does that make sense? So we tried to save the general fund by pooling a lot of those things that we could get fees for. There was a time, believe it or not, when a lot of communities had water in the general fund. But then we started getting these tools that it would make more sense to pull it out and run it as its own enterprise. My favorite fund on the list is the second one. It's called the Capital Projects Fund. And the reason I love that fund, remember I told you a fund is a self-balancing set of numbers. The reason I love the Capital Projects Fund is because with all of the other funds, at the end of the year, when you're done, let's take the general fund for example. If all of the money in the general fund does not get spent, at the end of the year, it goes into what we call it slips to fund balance. If you're in an enterprise fund, it slips to retained earnings. Stays within its own fund, but it's no longer in the appropriation that it was made. Didn't get spent, goes to the balance so that the legislative body can reappropriate it in the next year or leave it in savings as they choose. The Capital Projects Fund is a way that you can do forward planning. Remember I said planning matters. And so what you do is you set up a project in your Capital Projects Fund. It does not slip to the fund balance, stays with the project. So maybe over a couple of years you could put money into it and save up to do a project. Or if you have all the money you need, it doesn't fall away. It can stay in the project until the project's done. See why I like that one? It's kind of a cool fund. We can do fun things with it. Debt service funds is if you float a bond. Internal service funds is if you're a larger community and you provide services to your own government, so fleet or other services like that you would sell them through an internal service fund. Special revenue fund. This one is really important sometimes if you have a dedicated source of revenue and you want to hold the expenditures as discrete so that you can show that you're only spending what the revenue purpose was for. So that's kind of the way our funds work. It's fund accounting. I know that was really fast, but there are times through conferences that we can go into more detail. I've talked to you a little bit about these fund balances. In the fund balances, there are some limitations to how much money you can take. So what the legislature's decided is you can't raise taxes really high and build your fund balances really high because then you're having the citizens pay too much money for government. So there's a limit. If you're a district, and many of you are going to sit on district boards, so you need to understand this. If you're a district, it's 100%. You can have 100% of your budgeted revenue in your fund balance when they take that picture at the end of the year, the snapshot in time. Towns are at 75% and cities are at 25%. I'm going to skip the terms because we are running really fast on time here. I'm going to skip well, we won't. Your fiscal year runs July 1st to June 30th. If you sit on a district board, they run January 1 to December 31. Counties, January 1 to December 31. So when you're trying to do services together, it gets a little tricky, but you can do it. You can work it out. But your fiscal year is July 1 to June 30. You have to have public hearings to amend budgets. I've already talked to you about that a little bit. Reporting, we're going to talk about monitoring in a minute. Some of you are required to do some monthly reporting, but otherwise council should see at least quarterly financial reports. And then you have to file your budget with the state auditor 30 days after it's adopted. And then there's a whole financial package that needs to be filed within 180 days of year end. And your financial officer will keep you on top of those. These are the quick pieces of the municipal budget process. First step, prepare the tentative budget. And I don't want to go through these in too much detail on this slide because I'm going to break them into parts right now. So the first step and the last step are sort of the executive roles. The executive prepares, or the budget officer prepares the tentative budget. Then after the legislative adopts it over there at the end, they file it with the auditor. In between, those are kind of legislative functions. So it's what you do when you're operating as a council. Let's just jump into a little bit more detail. Your budget officer, in preparing your tentative budget, John Park asked me to make sure I put this date in. John, Gold star, it's in. First regularly scheduled meeting in May. That's when that budget is due. So if you're council, you should get your budget the first regularly scheduled meeting in May. But if you're doing a budgeting process, that shouldn't be the first time you're hearing about anything. Hopefully there will be conversations that are going on in your community as you try to align. You review your services and align them with the goals. You might look at service delivery options. Should we contract some things out? Should we continue doing them in-house? Review fees. This is one of my favorites. I was very chagrined at my home agency when I asked the question. I've been there 2.5 years at the State Department of Heritage and Arts. 2 weeks ago I said, where's our fee schedule and when's the last time we looked at it? I am telling you, the fee schedule can get away from you, and pretty soon you're not recovering the cost of service if you're not looking at your fees in some kind of a systematic and thoughtful way. So I'm taking my own advice now at my home agency, and we're reviewing fees. The tentative budget puts out some revenue and expense estimates and then prioritizes it and ships it off to the City Council as a tentative budget. The City Council adopts the tentative budget. You don't wait until the final budget. You adopt a tentative budget, you set a budget public hearing, and that sort of begins the legislative budget process. You make it available to the public, you invite them in to talk about it, and then you're probably going to have some discussions that happen as you review that tentative budget. Because remember, you got it the first Tuesday in May, and you don't have to adopt it, the final budget, until June 30th. These are some questions you might want to ask about the tentative budget. I won't read them all to you, but things like, are revenue estimates realistic? Let me tell you one of the tricks in one of the organizations I worked with. We had a new mayor come in who decided to push the revenue estimates so that there would be more money in the budget that could be budgeted for expenditures. Does that make sense? You have to question them. Are they realistic? Why would you all of a sudden say that we're going to have 10% more sales tax when that's not the growth trend we've been on? And that's why you want to look at trending, and you want to understand what those trends are so you can ask those questions. Are revenue estimates realistic? And then I'm going to take you down to the last one. Murray City had me come in a while ago, and we asked some really deep questions about, are services aligned with community need? Or are we just still funding things, but we haven't really gone out and talked kind of in a holistic way to the community and say, does the budget and the things that we're funding meet your needs? If I leave you with nothing more today, and I heard a lot of questions when Dave Church was talking about posting public meetings, transparency matters. It's not a fad. Demystify the numbers, and please, 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 let's not have the rhetoric. Let's have honest discussions with the public about what the revenue picture looks like, what the expenditures are, and how we can bring those two together. And then so through all of that process, and you're talking to people, and you're hearing from people, and you're understanding deeper what's in the budget, you make your adjustments, and you adopt your final budget, and you do that by June 30th. So do you see how if you're not having budget discussions through the year, you are worn out from the first Tuesday of May or whenever your first meeting is in May until June 30th? That's why I would suggest let's make it a more holistic process where we talk. And this is where I want you to really think like a beginner and shift the focus. Because if you're only looking at your budget from that first meeting in May until June 30th, what you're talking about is only the new things in the budget. And there is a whole base budget there that deserves your consideration and deserves you to take a look at it. And that's where you should ask your questions, and you should say, why do we do it this way? Let's not just focus on the new stuff. Let's sometimes talk about the base and focus on what are the historic decisions that have led to this. And I like to share a really quick story here with you. When I got married, I was pretty young, and I didn't know a lot about cooking, and I bought a roast, and I cut the two ends off the roast and put it in the pan, put it in the oven. And my husband said to me, what are you doing with those two pieces of meat that you've cut off each end? And I'm like, that's how you cook a roast. And he said, really? Like, I never saw my mom cook a roast that way. And so I called my mother and I said, why do you cut the ends off the roast? I got to tell Frank, like, it makes it better, right? And she said, no, I cut the ends off because my pan was too small. Okay, so it's a really good thing of ask the question, because it's like, well, gee, Mom, you should have bought a bigger pan, and my pan's bigger and the roast will fit in it. So ask the question. Let's not just do it because we've always done it. So then you file the budget. This flips back to the administrative responsibility. You file the budget with the state auditor. Now it comes back year long to legislative responsibility. Monitor and amend. So you need to get those quarterly reports, you need to look at them. Hopefully there's some narrative to go with them. I think the best monitoring reports have narrative. So I'll skip you past old Dilbert, and we'll talk about effective ways to monitor the budget. Periodic financial reviews are a really effective way for you to legislatively monitor the budget. Audit reports. I know a lot of you may not think that audit reports are the most exciting thing in the world to read, but believe me, if you ask me to come to your community and do a one-on-one training with you in your community, I will read your audit reports, and as Murray can attest, I will give you a quiz on your audit report to see if you know what's in that audit report. You can learn a lot about your finances in your community if you'll read those every year. Legislative intent reports. Some communities that I've worked with, we really use a process of having the council exert its policy influence over the budget through legislative intent statements. So it's, you know, it is the intent of the council that this happens. And then we monitor that through the year. Did it happen? We were trying to set some policy here. Did it happen? So that's another way that you can monitor the budget to make sure your policy is being implemented. Another way is periodic performance audits. You might want to hire an external consultant to come in and take a look at one of your programs. And you say, wow, we don't have enough money, maybe we shouldn't spend the money, but it's taking that step back and kind of looking at it through different and fresh eyes and saying, if this is the goal of the program and we've been funding it, are we hitting the goals? Is it working? Are we getting the performance we want out of whatever program it is we're looking at? And then I cannot emphasize enough, please, please make certain that you're looking at the historic revenue and expense trends so that you know if there's an aberration in that trend and you understand it. If there is an aberration, understand what that aberration is. Ask the questions. None of this should be hard. Ask the question until you understand it. Even in my home agency right now, there are times that I have to sit down with program managers and I have to say, I have to keep asking you these questions because I don't understand your answer yet. And if you can't explain it to me in a way that I can understand it, you're making it too complicated. You've got to get it to a point that I can understand it. Elements of a good monitoring report will have your prior year actual, current year budget, current year actual to date. I love to see that on a monitoring report. And I also like to have a column that shows me the prior year for the same period of time. I think that's a good thing for me to be able to look back at. And then my percent of current year compared to budget. And then there I go again, suggesting to you that you put in a narrative so that you talk through the numbers, describe the numbers, don't just have a list of numbers. Monitoring the budget. Let's talk about monitoring revenue. Part art, part science, part philosophy, part luck. You are hoping that some of your revenue sources come in high enough that those that come in low sort of balance you out. It is not a perfect game. There are lots of things that can affect your revenue in your community, and these are pictures of just a few of them. Interestingly enough, those same things affect your expenses. Expense control is really hard to get on top of if you don't pick it up until too late in the year. Okay, so if you're overspending a budget and you don't know it until quarter 3, you are in trouble because your choices are so limited as to what you can do to solve the problem. With that, I look forward to seeing you in St. George. I'll stick around if anybody has any questions. I hope you're as excited about municipal budgeting as I am. I think it's how you really get your job done. Thank you.